Hey there, you looking kinda cute. Don't forget to subscribe and check out my other socials for more. Enjoy. Gustavo and Adele stood facing each other in the dimly lit room. Candles flickered around them, casting dancing shadows on the walls. The ancient spellbook lay open between them, its yellowed pages filled with arcane symbols and incantations. "Are you sure about this?" Adele asked, her voice a mix of excitement and trepidation. Her long, chestnut hair fell in waves around her shoulders, framing her delicate features. Gustavo nodded, running a hand through his short, dark hair. "Absolutely. We've been planning this for months. It's a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity." They had stumbled upon the spellbook in a dusty corner of an antique shop, its leather cover worn and cracked with age. The shopkeeper had warned them of its power, but their curiosity had gotten the better of them. Now, after weeks of deciphering the ancient text and gathering the necessary ingredients, they were ready to attempt the impossible: a body swap. "Okay, let's do this," Adele said, taking a deep breath. She smoothed down her floral sundress, a nervous habit she'd had since childhood. Gustavo straightened his white shirt and adjusted his tie. As a successful businessman, he was used to taking risks, but this was unlike anything he'd ever done before. They joined hands and began to chant the words they had memorized. The candles flickered more intensely, and a wind seemed to whip through the room despite the closed windows. The air grew thick and heavy, pressing in on them from all sides. Suddenly, there was a blinding flash of light. Gustavo felt as if he was being yanked out of his body, spinning through a vortex of color and sensation. When the light faded and the room stopped spinning, he blinked, disoriented. The first thing he noticed was the weight on his chest. He looked down and saw the swell beneath Adele's floral sundress. His hands flew to his face, feeling the softness of Adele's skin, the fullness of her lips. "It worked," he whispered, but the voice that came out was Adele's, light and melodious. Across from him, he saw his own body staring back with wide eyes. Adele, now in Gustavo's form, was patting herself down, marveling at her new physique. "This is incredible," Adele said, her words coming out in Gustavo's deep baritone. "I can't believe we actually did it." Gustavo took a tentative step forward, immediately thrown off balance by the difference in his center of gravity. He wobbled slightly, unused to the extra weight on his chest and the narrower hips. "Careful," Adele cautioned, reaching out to steady him with Gustavo's larger hands. "It takes some getting used to." Over the next few hours, they explored their new bodies, marveling at the differences. Gustavo couldn't stop running his fingers through Adele's long hair, fascinated by the sensation. He explored the curves and contours of his new form, amazed at how different everything felt. Adele, meanwhile, was reveling in the strength of Gustavo's body. She flexed his muscles, delighting in the power she now possessed. She paced the room with long strides, enjoying the ease with which she could cover distance. As the initial shock and excitement wore off, they began to discuss the practicalities of their situation. "We agreed on a month, right?" Gustavo asked, still startled every time he heard Adele's voice coming from his mouth. Adele nodded, Gustavo's head bobbing in agreement. "Yes, 1 month to experience each other's lives. Then we'll meet back here and switch back." They spent the rest of the evening going over the details of each other's lives. Gustavo briefed Adele on his job as a corporate executive, explaining his current projects and important meetings. Adele, in turn, told Gustavo about her work as a graphic designer and her upcoming deadlines. As the night grew late, they realized it was time to part ways. They would each be returning to the other's home, stepping into a life that wasn't their own. "Good luck," Gustavo said, giving Adele an awkward hug. It felt strange to embrace his own body. "You too," Adele replied. "And remember, no one can know about this. We have to keep it a secret." With that, they left the room and stepped out into the cool night air, each heading towards a new life. The next morning, Gustavo awoke in Adele's apartment, momentarily disoriented by the unfamiliar surroundings. The events of the previous night came rushing back to him as he felt the softness of Adele's body against the sheets. He sat up, marveling again at the weight on his chest. The room was bathed in soft morning light, filtering through sheer curtains. Adele's apartment was cozy and feminine, with potted plants on every surface and colorful artwork adorning the walls. Gustavo swung his legs over the side of the bed, his feet barely touching the floor. He stood up, wobbling slightly as he adjusted to Adele's shorter stature. Making his way to the bathroom, he caught sight of himself in the full-length mirror. Adele's reflection stared back at him, sleep-tousled hair framing her face. He lifted a strand of long hair, marveling at its silky texture. After using the bathroom, an experience that was both awkward and enlightening, Gustavo decided to take a shower. He hesitated for a moment, feeling a bit like a voyeur, but reminded himself that this was his body now, at least for the next month. The sensation of water cascading over his new form was incredible. He took his time, exploring every curve and contour, fascinated by how different everything felt. The scent of Adele's shampoo filled the steamy air as he washed her long hair, enjoying the soothing process. After the shower, Gustavo stood wrapped in a towel, staring at Adele's closet. The array of dresses, skirts, and blouses was overwhelming. He had no idea where to start. After some deliberation, he selected a simple blue dress and a pair of comfortable flats. Dressing proved to be a challenge. The bra was particularly tricky, and it took him several attempts to fasten it correctly. The dress zipper was also a struggle, but he eventually managed to get everything in place. Looking in the mirror, Gustavo was struck by how different he looked. Adele's face stared back at him, but there was something off about the expression. He tried smiling, practicing until it looked natural. The final hurdle was makeup. Gustavo had watched Adele apply it countless times, but doing it himself was another matter entirely. He fumbled with the various brushes and tubes, trying to remember the correct order and technique. The end result was far from perfect, but it would have to do. As he prepared to leave for Adele's job at the design studio, Gustavo felt a mix of excitement and nervousness. He was about to step into a world he knew nothing about, pretending to be someone he wasn't. But there was also a thrill to it, the opportunity to experience life from a completely different perspective. Taking a deep breath, he grabbed Adele's purse, after spending several minutes searching for her keys and phone, and headed out the door. The click of his heels on the pavement was unfamiliar, and he had to concentrate to maintain his balance. The design studio was a bustling hive of activity when Gustavo arrived. He hesitated in the doorway, suddenly realizing he had no idea where Adele's desk was or what projects she was working on. "Morning, Adele!" a cheerful voice called out. A young woman with bright red hair waved at him from across the room. Gustavo waved back, hoping his smile looked genuine. He made his way through the office, trying to look like he knew where he was going. Finally, he spotted a desk with some of Adele's personal items and sat down with a sigh of relief. The computer screen in front of him was filled with half-finished designs and email notifications. Gustavo stared at it blankly, feeling completely out of his depth. In his own job, he was confident and in control. Here he felt like an imposter, which he supposed he was. "Hey, Adele," the red-haired woman from earlier approached his desk. "How's the Johnson account coming along? They're expecting the final designs by Friday." Gustavo blinked, trying to formulate a response. It's coming along. Just putting the finishing touches on it." The woman, whose name tag read Emma, gave him an odd look. "Are you feeling okay? You seem a bit off today." "Just a little under the weather," Gustavo replied quickly. "Nothing to worry about." Emma nodded sympathetically. "Well, take it easy. Let me know if you need any help with the Johnson stuff." As she walked away, Gustavo let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. This was going to be harder than he thought. He spent the next few hours fumbling through Adele's files, trying to make sense of her projects and deadlines. By lunchtime, Gustavo was exhausted. The constant fear of being discovered, combined with the unfamiliarity of Adele's work, had left him drained. He was about to sneak out for a solitary lunch when Emma and a few other women from the office approached his desk. "Come on, Adele," Emma said, linking her arm through his. "It's Taco Tuesday at Maria's. You can't miss it." Gustavo found himself swept along with the group, trying to keep up with their rapid-fire conversation. As they settled into a booth at the nearby Mexican restaurant, he marveled at the easy camaraderie between the women. It was so different from the often competitive atmosphere of his own workplace. So Adele, one of the women, Lisa, if he remembered correctly, leaned in conspiratorially. "Any progress with that cute barista, the one you've been crushing on for weeks?" Gustavo felt his face heat up. This was not a conversation he was prepared for. "Oh, not really," he stammered. "I've been pretty busy with work and all." The women exchanged knowing looks. "You should ask him out," Emma encouraged. "Life's too short to wait around." As the conversation flowed around him, Gustavo found himself relaxing. There was something liberating about being in this group of women, free from the pressures and expectations he usually faced. He even found himself joining in, offering tentative opinions on topics he never would have discussed in his own body. After lunch, the afternoon passed in a blur of design work and client calls. Gustavo was starting to get a handle on Adele's job, though he knew his work was far from her usual standard. He made a mental note to apologize to her later for potentially damaging her professional reputation. As he was packing up to leave, Emma stopped by his desk again. "Hey, a bunch of us are going for drinks later. You in?" Gustavo hesitated. He was exhausted and overwhelmed, but part of him was curious about this aspect of Adele's life. "Sure," he heard himself say. "Why not?" The bar was crowded and noisy, filled with after-work revelers. Gustavo sipped on a fruity cocktail, so different from his usual scotch, and tried to keep up with the conversation. He was starting to understand why Adele always seemed to know all the office gossip. As the night wore on, Gustavo became aware of a man at the bar who kept glancing in his direction. The man was tall and handsome, with a friendly smile. Under normal circumstances, Gustavo wouldn't have given him a second thought. But now, in Adele's body, he felt a flutter of something unfamiliar in his stomach. Emma noticed his distraction. "Ooh, looks like someone's caught your eye," she teased. "He's cute. You should go talk to him." Gustavo shook his head, suddenly nervous. "I don't think that's a good idea." "Come on, where's your sense of adventure?" Emma gave him a gentle push. "Go on. What's the worst that could happen?" Before Gustavo could protest further, he found himself being steered towards the bar. The man smiled as he approached, and Gustavo felt Adele's heart rate quicken. "Hi," the man said, his voice deep and warm. "I'm Michael. Can I buy you a drink?" Gustavo opened his mouth to decline, but what came out was, "Sure, I'd like that. I'm Adele." As Michael ordered their drinks, Gustavo had a moment of panic. What was he doing? This wasn't part of the plan, but as he looked at Michael's kind eyes and easy smile, he felt himself relaxing. They fell into conversation easily, discussing their jobs, their hobbies, their favorite spots in the city. Gustavo found himself enjoying the interaction, seeing it from a completely new perspective. He was used to being the pursuer in these situations, but being pursued was an entirely different experience. As the night wore on, Gustavo became more comfortable in his role as Adele. He laughed at Michael's jokes, touched his arm when he said something funny, even flirted a little. It was exhilarating and terrifying all at once. When it was time to leave, Michael asked for his number. Gustavo hesitated for a moment before reciting Adele's phone number. As he watched Michael input it into his phone, he felt a mix of excitement and guilt. This wasn't his life, wasn't his body. But for the next month, it was. That night, as Gustavo lay in Adele's bed, his mind was a whirlwind of thoughts and emotions. The day had been a roller coaster, filled with challenges and new experiences. He thought about Michael, about the easy camaraderie with Adele's coworkers, about the countless small ways in which life as a woman differed from his own. As he drifted off to sleep, Gustavo wondered what the rest of the month would bring. Little did he know, his adventure was only just beginning. The next few weeks passed in a blur of new experiences for Gustavo. Each day brought fresh challenges and discoveries as he navigated life in Adele's body. He grew more comfortable with her daily routines, from applying makeup to choosing outfits that felt both professional and feminine. At work, he slowly began to understand the intricacies of Adele's job. While he couldn't match her artistic talent, he found ways to contribute using his own skills in organization and client management. His colleagues noticed the change, commenting on Adele's newfound efficiency and business acumen. But it was his personal life that saw the most dramatic changes. Michael, the man from the bar, had become a constant presence. They went on several dates, each one leaving Gustavo more conflicted than the last. He enjoyed Michael's company immensely, finding him kind, funny, and genuinely interested in Adele's thoughts and opinions. But the guilt of deceiving him weighed heavily on Gustavo's conscience. One evening, about 2 weeks into their body swap, Gustavo found himself sitting across from Michael at a candlelit restaurant. The atmosphere was romantic, the food exquisite, but Gustavo's mind was elsewhere.
"Adele?"
Michael's voice broke through his reverie. "Is everything okay? You seem distracted."
Gustavo forced a smile. "I'm fine, just thinking about work."
Michael reached across the table, taking Gustavo's hand in his. The touch sent an unfamiliar thrill through Gustavo's body.
"You work too hard,"
Michael said softly.
"You should take some time for yourself."
As he looked into Michael's concerned eyes, Gustavo felt a surge of emotion he couldn't quite name. It was affection, certainly, but mixed with guilt and a growing sense of panic. This was becoming more than just an experiment or an adventure. He was developing real feelings for Michael, feelings that complicated everything.
"Michael?"
Gustavo began, not sure what he was going to say. But before he could continue, Michael leaned across the table and kissed him. The sensation was electric, unlike anything Gustavo had ever experienced. In that moment, all his doubts and fears melted away. When they finally parted, both slightly breathless, Michael smiled.
"I've been wanting to do that for a while," he admitted.
"Me too," he said softly, and was surprised to realize it was true. As they left the restaurant hand in hand, Gustavo's mind was spinning. He had never been attracted to men before, but in Adele's body, everything was different. The way Michael made him feel, protected, cherished, desired, was intoxicating. For the first time, he began to understand the appeal of being the pursued rather than the pursuer. Over the next few days, Gustavo found himself spending more and more time with Michael. They went for long walks in the park, cooked dinner together, spent lazy Sunday mornings curled up on the couch watching old movies. With each passing day, Gustavo felt himself falling deeper. But as his feelings for Michael grew stronger, so did his anxiety about the impending end of the body swap. The deadline was approaching fast, and Gustavo was no closer to figuring out what to do. How could he explain this to Michael? How could he possibly go back to his old life after experiencing this? 1 week before the swap was due to end, Gustavo received a text from Adele, or rather, from himself. She wanted to meet to discuss their situation. They arranged to meet at a quiet cafe, neutral ground for both of them. Seeing his own body walk into the cafe was a surreal experience. Gustavo watched as Adele, inhabiting his form, strode confidently to the table. She was wearing one of his best suits, her posture straight and commanding. "Gustavo," she said, sitting down across from him. "Or should I say Adele?" Gustavo smiled wryly.
"This is confusing, isn't it? How have you been? Me?"
Adele grinned, an expression Gustavo wasn't used to seeing on his own face. "It's been fascinating," she said. "I've learned so much about the business world. Your job is challenging, but I think I've managed to keep things running smoothly." They spent the next hour exchanging stories about their experiences. Adele talked about boardroom meetings and high-stakes negotiations, while Gustavo shared anecdotes about design projects and office dynamics. But there was one topic Gustavo was avoiding, one he knew he had to address. Finally, during a lull in the conversation, he took a deep breath. "Adele, there's something I need to tell you. I've met someone." Adele's eyes, his eyes, widened. "What do you mean you've met someone?" Gustavo explained about Michael, about their dates, about the growing feelings he couldn't ignore. As he spoke, he saw a range of emotions flicker across his own face: surprise, confusion, and finally understanding. "Oh, Gustavo," Adele said softly when he'd finished. "This complicates things, doesn't it?" Gustavo nodded miserably. "I don't know what to do. I can't bear the thought of hurting Michael, but how can I possibly explain this to him? And what happens when we switch back? Will these feelings go away? Will I still be attracted to him in my own body?" Adele reached across the table, taking his hand. It was strange to be comforted by his own larger hand. "I don't have all the answers," she said gently. "But I think you need to be honest with yourself about what you want. Do you want to switch back?" The question hit Gustavo like a punch to the gut. Until that moment, he hadn't allowed himself to consider the possibility of not switching back. But now, faced with the prospect of losing Michael, of losing this new life he'd built, he wasn't sure. I don't know," he admitted. "Part of me wants to stay like this. I've never felt this way before, Adele. Not just about Michael, but about everything. I feel free." Adele nodded, understanding in her eyes. "I know what you mean," she said. "Being you, it's opened up a whole new world for me, too. The respect, the power. It's intoxicating." They sat in silence for a moment, each lost in their own thoughts. Finally, Adele spoke again. "We don't have to decide right now," she said. "We still have a week. Let's take that time to really think about what we want, and then we'll make a decision." Gustavo nodded, feeling a mix of relief and apprehension. As they parted ways, he couldn't shake the feeling that his entire future hung in the balance. Whatever decision they made, nothing would ever be the same again. The final week of their body swap was a whirlwind of emotions for Gustavo. He threw himself into Adele's life with renewed vigor, determined to experience everything he could before making his decision. He poured his heart into her work projects, spent quality time with her friends, and savored every moment with Michael. Michael, sensing something was different, became even more attentive. He surprised Gustavo with romantic gestures: flowers delivered to the office, impromptu picnics in the park, tender moments that left Gustavo breathless. With each passing day, the idea of giving this up became more and more unbearable. The night before their scheduled switchback, Gustavo lay awake in Adele's bed, his mind racing. He thought about his old life, the corporate success, the material wealth, the respect he commanded. But it all seemed hollow compared to the richness of emotion he'd experienced in the past month. He thought about Michael, about the way his heart raced when they were together. He thought about Adele's friends, about the sense of community and support he'd never known he was missing. He thought about the simple pleasures he'd discovered, the feel of a soft breeze on bare legs, the satisfaction of creating something beautiful with his hands, the freedom to express emotions without judgment. As the first light of dawn crept through the window, Gustavo made his decision. He reached for his phone, Adele's phone, and sent a text. "I want to stay, if you're willing." The response came almost immediately. "I was hoping you'd say that. Me too." Relief washed over Gustavo. He felt as if a weight had been lifted from his shoulders, but there was still one more hurdle to overcome. Later that day, Gustavo met Michael in the park where they'd had their first real date. His heart was pounding as Michael approached, a warm smile on his face. "Adele," Michael said, "is everything okay? You sounded serious on the phone." Gustavo took a deep breath. "Michael, there's something I need to tell you."
Something unbelievable. But I need you to listen with an open mind. Can you do that for me?" Michael's brow furrowed in concern, but he nodded. "Of course, you can tell me anything." And so Gustavo told him everything. He explained about the spell, about the body swap, about his true identity. As he spoke, he watched Michael's expression change from confusion to disbelief to shock. When he finished, there was a long moment of silence. Gustavo held his breath, waiting for Michael's reaction. Finally, Michael spoke. "This is a lot to take in," he said slowly. "If it were anyone else, I'd think this was some kind of elaborate joke. But I know you, Adele, or Gustavo, and I can see in your eyes that you're telling the truth." Gustavo felt a glimmer of hope. "So, what does this mean for us?" Michael was quiet for a moment, his brow furrowed in thought. Then, to Gustavo's surprise, he smiled. "It means," he said softly, "that I fell in love with who you are, not what body you're in. It's going to take some getting used to, but if you're willing to try, so am I." Tears of relief and joy sprang to Gustavo's eyes. He threw his arms around Michael, holding him tight. "Thank you," he whispered. "Thank you for understanding." As they walked hand in hand through the park, Gustavo felt a sense of peace settle over him. He knew there would be challenges ahead, explaining the situation to friends and family, navigating the legal complexities of their new identities. But for now, he was content. He had found a new life, a new love, and a new understanding of himself. And as he looked ahead to the future, he knew that the adventure was only just beginning. Months passed, and Gustavo settled into his new life as Adele. The initial challenges of maintaining their switched identities gradually gave way to a new normal. Gustavo threw himself into Adele's career with renewed passion, combining his business acumen with her creative talents to take the design studio to new heights. His relationship with Michael blossomed. After the initial shock wore off, Michael had embraced Gustavo's true identity with open-minded curiosity. They spent long evenings talking about Gustavo's experiences, his new perspectives on life and love. Michael's unwavering support and acceptance only deepened Gustavo's feelings for him. One sunny Saturday morning, about 6 months after the body swap, Gustavo woke up to find Michael on one knee beside the bed, a small velvet box in his hand. "Gustavo," Michael said, his voice thick with emotion. "I know our story isn't conventional, but I've never been more certain of anything in my life. Will you marry me?" Tears sprang to Gustavo's eyes as he nodded, too overwhelmed to speak. As Michael slipped the ring onto his finger, Gustavo marveled at the journey that had brought him to this moment. The wedding was a small, intimate affair. Gustavo and Adele had managed to explain their situation to a select few friends and family members who attended the ceremony. As Gustavo walked down the aisle in a flowing white gown, he caught Adele's eye. She was beaming at him from the front row, looking dapper in a suit that once belonged to him. Married life suited Gustavo. He and Michael settled into a cozy routine, balancing their careers with their life together. They traveled, tried new restaurants, hosted dinner parties for their friends. Gustavo found himself embracing domestic tasks he'd never bothered with before. Cooking elaborate meals, tending to a small herb garden on their balcony, redecorating their apartment to reflect both their tastes. About a year into their marriage, Michael broached the subject of starting a family. Gustavo was hesitant at first. The idea of pregnancy and childbirth was daunting, to say the least. But as they discussed it more, he found himself warming to the idea. The thought of creating a life, of nurturing and raising a child with Michael, filled him with a longing he'd never experienced before. After much consideration and preparation, they decided to try for a baby. The process was a roller coaster of emotions: hope, disappointment, anxiety, excitement. Finally, after months of trying, Gustavo saw those 2 pink lines on the pregnancy test. The pregnancy was a revelation. Gustavo marveled at the changes in his body, the first flutter of movement,
the gradual swell of his belly. Michael was endearingly overprotective, attending every doctor's appointment, reading every parenting book he could get his hands on. As his due date approached, Gustavo found himself reflecting on the incredible journey that had led him to this point. If someone had told him 2 years ago that he'd be married to a man, pregnant, and happier than he'd ever been, he would have laughed in their face. Yet here he was, on the cusp of motherhood, filled with a sense of purpose and joy he'd never known was possible. The day their daughter was born was the most intense and beautiful experience of Gustavo's life. The pain was unlike anything he'd ever felt, but the moment he held his baby girl in his arms, it all faded away. Looking into her tiny face, Gustavo felt a love so profound it took his breath away. They named her Luna, a name that symbolized new beginnings. As Gustavo cradled Luna in the hospital bed, Michael by his side, he felt a sense of completeness. This was where he was meant to be. The early days of parenthood were a blur of sleepless nights, diaper changes, and overwhelming love. Gustavo took to motherhood with a devotion that surprised even himself. He cherished every moment. The late-night feedings, the first smile, the soft weight of Luna sleeping on his chest. As Luna grew, so did Gustavo's appreciation for his new life. He loved the way she looked at the world with wonder, the sound of her laughter, the feeling of her tiny hand in his. He and Michael made a great team, supporting each other through the challenges of parenthood and reveling in its joys. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to check out my other socials if you want more wonderful content, early access, behind the scenes, and more. All links down below.